Okay, hi, welcome back. Another version here, another clip here on Diesel Talk. In this case, we're going to be talking about Dodge Ram, in this case from 2005 roughly all the way to 2014. Things changed a lot in 2015 with Dodge Ram. You're going to notice that the Ram name has replaced the Dodge badge. You can see that with the newer trucks. Just make a note of that because in many cases you're going to look up Ram on a scan tool or Dodge, depending what year model you're talking about, especially when you're dealing with service manuals too. But what to do when we don't have communication? So let's get into the ECM and the TIPM itself. Let's move forward here. Communication issue. How many times have we had a communication issue with a Cummins computer, especially on those 5, 9, and 6, 7s? ECM does not respond. In this case, you're trying to communicate, get codes, get data, nothing. You got no communication, no access into the system itself. You got no communication. So the question is a TIPM responsive, better known as a totally integrated power module? And in this case, that totally integrated power module is telling us what's pretty much communicating. In other words, the gateway. Let me not get too far off. So when you diagnose and you got a no communication issue, don't immediately think it's always the ECM. It could be wiring, it could be connectors, but we also need to know there's another module involved. There's the gateway, which is the TIPM module. So I guess the first thing you can do after not communicating to ECM is try talking to the TIPM module, see if it communicates. Now, it all starts your diagnostics with the data, your data link connector, diagnostic link connector, as many call it. And in this case, when you look at your DLC, you're going to notice we have 16 cavities, 16 pins, and we got to know the basics. Hopefully you know the basics. If not, let's review them. You see 4 and 5. 4 and 5 is your ground, and you also see 16, which is battery power. Now, the communication lines, those are 6 and 14. Now, that is better known as CAN negative or CAN positive, but let's just call it CAN for now. Controller Area Network. Those are the two wires that communicate to the network. You see, the TIPM is the gateway, so 6 and 14 are directly hardwired to the TIPM module, totally integrated power module. Now, before you get started with going with, a lot of diagnostics, it requires you to have a multimeter. And in this case, when you use your multimeter, what you simply want to do is measure voltage DC, and you want to measure battery voltage. But before you do this, make sure you have tested the batteries. Batteries terminals are clean, and you have measured that battery voltage. So in this case, we're going between 16, which is again positive battery voltage, and we're going between 4 and then 5. 4 and 5 are grounds, but you need to verify both just to keep everything diagnostic correct. So again, 16 to 4 and 16 to 5. You should have battery voltage. You should have no greater than 4/10 of a volt. In this case, a voltage drop variance from the battery. If you do, then there's some high resistance faults going to that. And that's another diagnostic to do. But we're sticking to the communication side of it. But make sure you do have battery voltage. Now, in this case, we see, as we look very closely here with pretty much the diagram, we notice there is, as you can see, there is 6 and there is 14. Those are communication wires. You'll notice that these circuits are D52 and D51. Now, when we go upwards towards, in this case, here's our TIPM module. There we see the TIPM module right there. We notice we have connector 6, cavity 10, and pretty much cavity 2. Now, this is all part of connector 6 because the TIPM has over 10 connectors on it. So you got to identify the correct color and the correct connector that you're working on, which, again, the service manual does have a lot of that information for you. So we got to get used to finding that info too. Now, let's go here. Now, for those of you who don't know what the TIPM, let's say you're new to this business. In this case, there is your, here it is, there's this guy right here. This right here looks like your fuse box. Well, it is a fuse box, but it's also your TIPM module. Underneath this TIPM module, there are 10 connectors. Yes, there are 10 connectors that are hanging on to there. So it's important to understand that you got to treat this with love because you got a lot of connectors. So it isn't surprising that I'll find zip ties around these modules themselves because somebody broke a lock on one of the lock tabs for one of the 10 connectors. So again, treat with care because you can get a lot of intermittent problems when it comes to this TIPM module right here. Now, at that point, nothing you got to keep in mind is along this being a fuse box, it's a module, like I said, it is programmable. So one of the things you may want to do from time to time, especially when you have electrical problems, is there an update to the TIPM module? You can program an ECM, but you can also program a TIPM module. In many cases, when you get a TIPM module, it may need update programming or programming depending who you got it through. So keep that in mind. Here's a better view of the TIPM module. There's the fuses right here on the right. We can see the fuses. And in this case, when you get a TIPM module, usually from the dealership, you're going to notice these right here are the yellow ones. Are usually popped up. That's for the airbag system. So once you install and program, you're supposed to push these downward and again connect the airbag system back up. So that's a safety precaution, I guess they put in there. Here's a better view of the side view of the connectors on the TIPM itself. And in this case, we see, again, 10 connectors going there. A lot of wiring coming out of there. So let's take a look at the big picture here. This is a wiring diagram that may drive you crazy, but I'm going to go ahead and zoom it up here. Let's start off first at the ECM. Here at the ECM, as we follow my cursor, you're going to see we have connector 1, connector 1. So the communication takes between 4 and number 5. Now, as I move this diagram and follow these two wires, now there's two wires here. These wires or their circuit numbers are D64, David 64, and D65, David 65. So in this case, 4, connector 1, terminal 4, all the way to cavity 1 or terminal 1 on connector 6 going towards the TIPM. Here we could see the TIPM. So if we focus on one wire, we're going to focus on that. Why am I going to focus on that? Because, let's see it full bore, here's the ECM. The ECM communicates through these two wires going to the TIPM. Earlier, we saw in the previous diagram, 6 and 14, terminal 6 and 14 diagnostic link connector talking to the TIPM. Now the TIPM talks to the ECM. So if you haven't grasped this yet, let me just review. Diagnostic link connector wired to the TIPM, another two wires going, as we can see right here, that are going straight to the ECM. And that's what we see going on here. Okay, so as a sample diagnostic, we need to understand the connector end views. Here you can see connector 1. Here we can see connector 2. Again, these are all located on the ECM. And we see connector 6 being used from the TIPM. Remember, there are 10 connectors in the TIPM module itself. So in this case, we got to be careful to make sure we get the right connector, which is connector 6. Now, those of you not familiar with a Dodge Ram Cummins 5967, there's connector 1, and we see connector 2. Obviously, connector 1's towards the front of the vehicle, and connector 2's towards the driver. But in this case, we see the two connectors right there. So it's important to identify which is which, connector 1 and connector 2. And here's a sample diagram that's available in your service manual that should help you in your diagnosis. So there we see connector 1. We see terminal 1 all the way to 10, we see 1 all the way to 10, and we see again 51 through 60, and you could do the counting in between. We got connector 2, same thing again. We see, all the way from 1 all the way to 10, and 11 through 20, and 21 through 30, and the list goes on. Then we look at the connector on the TIPM, connector 6. So in this case, we see number 1, we see number 8, 9 through 16, and so on. So you can identify which terminal you're working with. Now, if I use a sample of the diagnosis of no communication, it's there in the service manual. And in this case, if I follow the directions, turn the ignition off. For example, we're testing one circuit, which is circuit D65. In this case, we see that they're telling you to measure resistance, and you're going to go to the brown connector. And in this case, we see terminal 1 right there. So they said, measure resistance of D65. Now, we're looking at D65, so we're going to 1. And here, tiny over here, you're going to see, and let me zoom it up for you. We're going to see, again, connector. Let me push it down. And we see, again, terminal 4 right there. So in this case, we see we're doing a continuity check between these two. And what we're just simply testing is the wire in case we have an open circuit, a grounded circuit, or resistance. That's what we're checking for. So the specifications here is calling for no more than 5 ohms. That's what they're telling you. No more than 5 ohms. That's what we're looking for. But I'm not going to go through a whole diagnosis. I'm just giving you a sample of what you can read and understand in the service manual so you know what you're testing. But this will not make sense if you don't know the connector end views, as shown, or the diagram itself. So to review one more time, let me again zoom this up for you. If I'm looking at D, this connector, this right here, I'm going to go between, this wire. I'm going to check continuity between terminal 1 here and all the way down here to terminal 4 here. Connector 1 on the ECM, and like we've been saying over and over again, connector 6 on the TIPM module. Obviously, if I'm doing the next one, it would be, let's see, it's 3 and also cavity 5 right here, which is the, what is this one? This one would be D64. So D64 and D65. Sorry, it's a little blurry, but the other one's clear. But in this case, all I'm just trying to show you as I look at the diagram is we can do continuity checks between the TIPM module and the ECM. And they're right next to each other, believe it or not, in the engine compartment, because the TIPM, like we said already, is on that right-hand fender, driver's side fender in front of the battery. And the ECM is located right there next to the engine block. So maybe it's not that easy to get to the ECM, but you can do it through the fender well if necessary. But in this case, you're doing continuity checks. So what are we saying here? Is that you need to understand, what's going on here. We see the TIPM here, and I decided to put here this is the best diagram I could find, believe it or not. I'll find a better one later, but in this case, we see the 10 connectors, and this is what I'm trying to show you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So in this case, we got 10 connectors. That's why I told you, you got to be careful with the TIPM and the wiring. You don't want to break a lock on one of these connectors, because then you're going to have to hold it up. And let me tell you, doing a pigtail on one of these is no fun. No fun at all, because you're talking about a lot of wires from 16, or if not more than 30. So please be careful, treat them with love as you lift up on that TIPM. Be gentle, disconnect gently. In this case, you want to ruin any of those connectors, because they're not the best plastic locks on them either. So in a nutshell, what have we learned? Well, I hope you've learned, is you don't communicate. And in this case, these trucks use a TIPM as a gateway. You check the diagnostic link connector for power and ground, and then you're going to check for continuity between those wires between the ECM and the TIPM, and also from the TIPM to the diagnostic link connector, see if that's the problem. Now, you're going to have to make the determination at that point who's bad. So if the TIPM's not responding and you have good continuity, yeah, the TIPM would need to be actually serviced, provided we check the powers and grounds going to the TIPM. Hope this tips helps, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks for watching.